computer. All right, this is going to be the virtual lecture for cit251, lesson 3, topic 2. We're going to talk about risk assessment, risky business as it's called, or that's the title of the lecture. So we'll get started. Let me share out the web, my Chrome, and I'm going to make this smaller. All right, so here's our shell. Again, it's going to be under lessons. Lesson 3, topic 2, and it's not available. What a mess! What did I? It's almost like hopefully it's going to be here. It's like D80 got okay. Good, it's all here. All right, so all right, let me click on the slides, and we'll get started. All right. So again, this is going to be more of a business side of things, less technical. So because we're dealing with the financials and kind of risk assessment. Next topic, we're going to actually talk about pen testing. So that'll be more technical, but this right now is going to be a less technical thing, and therefore the practice itself is also less technical. Next practice will be a little bit more, quite a bit more technical. Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Is that lesson, I'm not seeing it on Blackboard. Does it have to be like enabled? Or
I think I need to make it visible. So let me do that right now.
Okay,
that was
thanks.
my fault. I'll exit out. And then I noticed that just when I got in here that it wasn't visible. You'll get to see the secret sauce here. As usual, I'm not big on secret sauce. Lessons 3, and we're gonna make available. If you do a refresh, you should see it now and get to be able to get to the slides.
Yeah, it's up.
Okay. All right. So here are the slides. All right. So this. Again, it's going to be a little bit later, I think, subject matter. So hopefully we can get this done in one day. But I always find that if I think I'm going to get something done in one day, it often takes two lectures, one lecture, 2 lectures. So we'll get started. So with great assets come great threats. The other Uncle Ben. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about assets, threats, and risks, right? Assets. All businesses have assets. I hope so. Well, I guess shell businesses. I have a link here to a really good movie if you're looking for something to watch on Netflix about a real life event. It was a real lawyers down in, I want to say Buenos Aires, but no, Panama. It was done in Panama. That's why it was Panama Papers. Anyway, it was a shell. They just created shell companies for rich people. So. Legit businesses have assets. Not legit businesses don't have assets. They just are there to move money around or look like they have assets when they don't. So if we have something of value, then we have something to lose. Sometimes enterprises don't evaluate all their assets properly. Again, you can over-evaluate. There's all kinds of biases that we'll talk about, but you tend to over-evaluate your own assets and under-evaluate other people's assets. That's unknown biases. Asset valuation is real and a contractable service, right? For that reason, to get an outside perspective, consultant comes in. Again, because we are humans, and humans are all innately biased in certain ways. Judging our own assets tends to be a very difficult process. So if you can find yourself a good consultant that comes in and can honestly and expertly judge your assets, that's a valuable resource in itself. All right. So threats. Again, if we have assets, there's going to be threats to those assets, right? So doing a threat assessment. As we've seen, there are many threats, and we don't know them all. It could be helpful to do an asset out view of your threats. In other words, look at, here's my asset. I have these, what we're going to be using in this practice. I have these digital plans. I have these plans that are digitized, that need to be digitized. That's an asset for me because I can take those plans and send them to the shop floor. That's why they need to be digitized, and that's why they need to be online. They get sent to the shop floor, and it produces this product, and I can sell this product, right? It's an asset, right? So I have a threat though. It's on a server. That server needs to be accessed, right? Okay, how can people get to these digital plans then, right? So looking asset out might be a way to help you visualize the threats, right? To look for threats from the perspective of the attacker, you can sit there and say, okay, if I'm an attacker and I want to get to those digital plans, how would I do it, right? Again, that's a little bit trickier though, because are you a better attacker? Are you a worse attacker than the actual one? So you might come at it at a different way, right? Classifying threats are important. These are things we're going to talk. We have as terminology for this lesson, for this topic. We have internal threats versus external threats. That's pretty self-explanatory. Again, it's what again, the easiest way to get to many things is simply to the most simple approach. What if I just bribe someone in your company to copy those digital plans to a thumb drive and walk out of the company, right? Why spend years and years getting through your firewall and sending spear phishing and and setting up a reverse HTTP remote access tool? Well, I could just simply, the asset's worth $1 million. I give $100,000 to one of your employees and have them copy the plans for me, right? So that'd be a part of your internal threat, right? What controls do we have on the internal side of what in our control, our side of the network, to make sure that we're preventing that asset from being exposed, right? External threats, that's more coming from the outside, right? Of course, we could just have angry employees or employees that want to split off and make their own company, their own businesses, right? And maybe if they grab your plans, they can kind of make a tweak here and make a tweak there, and it'll be different enough they can get their own patent, right? Now you have competition. So again, that's also part of the internal. Man-made versus nature. I think we've, man-made threats is what makes the news, right? It's even now, and even with a natural threat that we have with this pandemic, we're seeing a lot of stories. I don't know if you're seeing all these stories, but the WHO has been under attack. Someone did a spear phishing and a redirect attack on them. There's been a couple other stories out there. The man-made stories make the news, right? Because what are those hackers up to, right? So we tend to over-evaluate the man-made when in reality, nature is going to do more damage to your business in a more realistic way, right? So, intentional versus unintentional. There's just good old-fashioned screw-ups. Things can break. People can run a backhoe into your server room, right? So you got to focus on that stuff too. Again, the intentional stuff gets the attention because what are those bad guys up to? What are they going to do to us? And then it's of course you spend millions of dollars with firewalls, an intrusion detection system, honeypots, a CISO, a security team of 3 people that you pay that combined $300,000 a year, right? And then what ends up happening is someone accidentally hits the fire alarm and you forgot to turn off the sprinklers in the computer room, right? And it causes millions of dollars of damage, right? Unintentional. So you also have to consider that as well, okay? One thing we could do to try to help us understand things is build threat trees. Stupid pop-up menu. I hate it. So now I can't click on this. So I'll click on this one here. This is an example of an attack tree. What you're doing is you start off with just a general vector of attack, right? In this case, a virus infects a file. This came from Wikipedia, as you can see, right? Virus run as an administrator, or virus run as a normal user. In other words, what you're doing is you're just going down the path, getting to the end, right? So other infected programs, user downloads and runs infected naked binary. In this case, if you run as administrator, you can exploit a root hole, virus run by an admin, which is kind of repetitive there, but you can infect other programs, infect the install package, admin downloads and runs infected naked binary.
So essentially just like a flow chart that they would have like mapped out.
Yeah, so what the attack tree, what you're trying to do is you start off with a vector. Let me give you some better other examples. If this stupid slide thing will leave me alone. All right, so there you go. So let me go to some other ones here. This is more general, right? So this is the way the incident itself. So you're thinking of the incident, right? The causes that could have the incident happen, the vulnerability they're going to exploit, right? That'd be the symptom, and then how could we possibly stop that? That's how this particular format went. And here's another example of a test attack tree. Whoop, didn't like that one. Let's see if I can get to it. All right, there you go. So in this case, they had the overall attack being reading other people's emails. Well, okay, well, how can we read other people's emails? This is a great example of an attack tree, right? We can observe email at the user's PC, right, just by looking at their screen, right? And so a more physical type thing. Or we can look at the keystroke logger, right? We can install spyware, right? I would actually just make that more general and do spyware. Read other users' email. We can monitor the network, so we can actually do a man-in-the-middle attack, and just and these are different vulnerabilities that would allow us to run a man-in-the-middle attack. They'll look at the actual data in transit, or we can read it right off the mail server. Well, how can we get access to a main? How would we gain access to a mail server? Well, we can acquire valid username and password for the email server. We can exploit an OS vulnerability, right? So what this just helps you do, this helps you visualize the actual attack itself, right? And then it lets you kind of figure out, okay, well, how do we prevent someone from acquiring a valid username and password, right? It lets you kind of focus in on how to stop that threat, all right? Does that make sense? This is probably the best example, this one right here. This is the example I would prefer the best out of the three of those. But these are just three ones. I was looking for different ways. Again, if we're doing reports, if we're doing strategitic work, there's no perfect way. There's no this is the right way, this is the wrong way. I hate to break it to you, right? It's a world of gray. It's not a world of black and white, right? Unlike the Cisco class, which we just came from, where it either works or doesn't work. I can either ping the server or I can't. We don't have that luxury. This is the real world, right? So how you do your attack tree, again, I like this attack tree. This is helpful for me, right? This is what we're afraid of. This is how it could possibly happen, right? And it just shows me how that could possibly happen, right? While this person here takes a more of a strategic view, they're giving a different purpose to it. I'm not in love with that. And this one here is a little bit vague and I think less helpful. But again, all this does is try to help us try to visualize the threat. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So that being said, risks. All right. Quite simply, if you have an asset and you got a threat, you got a risk. Okay. So how are we going to properly assess the risk? All right. We have to assess the asset and the threat. If we're going to understand risk, we have to get the two variables, right? These are all variables, and as you can see, risk is dependent on the asset and the risk and the threat. Okay. So in order to figure out the risk, we need to properly assess the asset, and we also need to properly assess the threat. Okay. Poor evaluation is what gets people out of problems. A key effect. A key effect is the classic one where if you put it together yourself, then you think it's worth more value. It's named after the Swedish manufacturer IKEA or IKEA stores, for anyone that's been there, where they have a lot of furniture they put together, right? It tends to be crappy, cheap furniture, but because someone put it together themselves, they feel that they give it more value than it actually has. Okay, where does that come into affecting the company? Well, a company that has an asset. Whoops, now I have. That happened. Yeah. So a company that has developed a product themselves, right, from scratch. They developed a secret formula, or the actual, how this engine works, or something like that, might have a tendency to over-evaluate that asset more so than it really is. Okay. The sunken cost fallacy is also related. The sunken cost fallacy is essentially if you put money into something, we put money into something, we don't want to lose that. We don't want to admit defeat, right? So if someone puts money into a project, either to secure it or the project itself, they're going to count that money they put into that project as part of the value, which is not correct, right? So it's like, hey, we got this web server up and running. It cost us, $5 million to get this web server up and running. Well, it's only making your company $150,000 a year, so it's probably worth $1 million, right? Because things are going to change. It'll make you $1 million in maybe a year's time, right? So that $5 million is just sunken money, right? It doesn't justify you spending $4 million to protect the $5 million you spent on the server, right? That's what they mean by sunken cost. Well, I spent $50, I might as well spend $100. It's like, no, now you just spend $150, right? So anyway, that's the sunken cost fallacy. Also talking about biases, we also have the zero risk bias, which is going to be important here. The zero risk bias essentially says the way human nature is, we would keep pursuing getting a low risk down to what we think is zero or really small to actually taking care of a bigger thing. So case in point, like war against terrorism, right? We're willing to spend billions of dollars on war against terrorism, but traffic accidents, we give a minor, or gun violence for that matter. When in actuality, terrorism is going to kill a lot less people than traffic accidents or gun violence, right? So it tends to be, again, so what we see in our industry particularly is, people are really concerned about hackers, but again, not too concerned about the backhoe, or they forget to disable the fire extinguishers in the computer room, and that causes us to have even a worse effect than some hacker getting into our network. So anyway, a zero risk bias to boil it down means we rather spend more time getting a low chance down to what we think is zero than something that has a much greater chance of happening, and just simply reducing that down to half, right? We think that's a better time and a way to spend our efforts and our assets. So any questions so far? We're going to get into hard numbers soon, so we're still in the theoretical. All right. So what does risk assessment do then? Well, first of all, garbage in, garbage out. The good old rules of IT are still prevalent. Bad data can be costly. We'll be using these assessments to assign values and justify costs. So assessments need to be objective, right? We need to be able to fight through the nonsense and, again, like the biases we just talked about, but sit there saying, no, this web server makes you this much money, right? So it's worth this much money, or this business processes, these plans make you this much money, or worth this much money, right? So you need to be objective. From a deep well of experience and expertise, again, this is something where a lot of knowledge set comes in. Being in the industry, understanding how the industry works, understanding the true value of what some of these things are, and justified with solid investigation. So you gather value from financial reports. So those financial reports need to be available to you. So if you are doing an assessment evaluation, you need to see the numbers. You need to see how much the money the company actually makes. Is it just all borrowed money and nonsense, right? So anyway, that's all important. So you need to have the right numbers where you can get them, and you need to be objective, right? There you go. That's to properly evaluate. So I rewrote that in a better way. All right, there you go. Evaluation of assets, must know the true value, needs access to financial records, can judge value based on market. So you need to both know what the company's done and how the market is, of threats, where the expertise comes in, right? Understanding. So you also have to evaluate the threat too, right? So you need to understand, is that truly a threat? Is that not truly a threat, right? People have their concerns about certain things, VPNs now, there's a lot of talk about, especially in today's current situation, of VPNs being a possible vulnerability. Well, okay, cool. Show me, who's writing in a VPN into a corporate network, right? I forgot my wife was just talking about doing some hospital administration remotely that she's been jumping up and down for 2 years now, trying to get the hospital to deploy. and they haven't done it. Well, guess what? This pandemic hits, and all of a sudden, like magic, all of a sudden, oh yeah, we can get that done, right? So now this remote, this function of the hospital's network that wasn't available before had to happen, right? So a lot of people are can over evaluate threats, and this is where the expertise comes in, right? You have to be able to fight through the fear and paranoia, and sometimes truly evaluate what the threat is, right? Of risk, we need to evaluate our risk, right? If we have the first two, the assets and the threats, we can assign value to the risk. So how do we turn these into numbers? All right. First of all, we need to understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative risk calculations. Qualitative ratings are symbolic ratings. They're subjective, right? That's like giving a risk factor. What's the risk factor of setting up a web server? What's the risk factor, right? And we can say, oh, it's a risk factor of 4. What the hell does that mean? Well, 4 out of 10, right? It's kind of just this kind of number that helps us understand it, right? It's not truly a number. It's not as rock solid as a number. It's not like I have, 2 hands. That's a rock solid number. I have 2 hands and 10 fingers, right? That's hard to debate that, right? This is more kind of like, I'm giving it a, it's a threat level 4. Well, what does threat level 4 exactly mean, right? So that's a qualitative rating. Well, quantitative ratings are dollar values. Now, it can still be based off of something, because we're gonna blend the two a little bit. We're gonna have some qualitative ratings used to figure out quantitative ratings. So it's not that rock solid, and there's a little bit of shenanigans, shall we say, going on here, right? But at the end of the day, a dollar value is a dollar value, right? And what we're able to say is, like, this is real world dollars. This has a real world effect, okay? Now, why is this important? Well, this is critical for us in the security industry and IT because it helps us get budget, okay? If we sit there and say, listen, you're losing by not doing anything, by the network being as secure as it is now and having these assets on the network, you are going to lose on average $1,500 a year, right? What I'm saying is, well, that's not a lot of money, but $1,500 a year. Let's make it a little bit more, $4,000 a year, right? What I'm saying is, you should be giving me a budget of $4,000 a year, right, to try to protect these assets, because you're going to lose it eventually. That money is not going to happen this year, and that's where it's kind of a little flaky, because the quantitative ratings are not going to say you're definitely going to lose $5,000 a year. Every year you lose $5,000. It's not a hard number, right? It's more of just an overall way to look at it. What we're saying is, in 5 years' time, this asset's going to get exposed, and the overall value was $100,000. We'll see the actual math. And so it's as if you're losing $5,000, because now you're going to lose. We're going to have what's called the exposure factor. By that asset getting hacked, it's going to lose $20,000 of value. So, or $25,000, $20,000, that gives me 4. $20,000, so that's like losing $4,000 every year, right? Again, it's not hard numbers. You're not going to lose that. It's not coming out of your bank account every single year. But what we're saying is, it's as if you might as well not even have, or you might as well just account for $4,000 a year being lost. Okay, we'll show you how to do those numbers in a bit, but that's what we're doing, and we're going to use those numbers to justify budget, right, and to be able to try to protect this information. Okay. So we have risk likelihood versus risk impact. Going back real quick, the takeaway on this is qualitative ratings are more symbolic. Quality, think of quality, right? What's the quality? It's very, while quantitative are tied back to dollar values. Okay, so it's a little bit harder. Okay, I poo-poo both of them, of course, but again, by the way, this is MBA talk. This is Masters of Business Administration talk, right? They're the ones that spend whole semesters talking about qualitative and quantitative, right? And they love this stuff. They love it, right? If I could go up there and say, I'm going to give you a quantitative rating that you're losing $5,000 a year by not doing anything, they're going to sit up in their chair and go, whoa, I'm losing $5,000, right? They take that stuff seriously, right? So I'm going to use those tools to justify my budget, my hiring, my whatever I'm doing, right? Any questions about that before I move on? The qualitative versus quantitative? And again, there's whole semesters, there's whole economic theory, there's economic debate. I don't know how much people pay attention to the news, but I'm sure you see lots of economists yelling back and forth at each other about whether or not sending out a $1,200 check to everyone is actually going to help the economy or not, right? So economics is not is in itself a kind of qualitative subject, right? It really depends on what school you belong to, what your way of thinking is. Are you a supply sider? Are you a demand sider? Right? So there's a lot more theory than there are hard numbers. So anyway, and the debate about qualitative versus quantitative and how reliable those two are is an ongoing, never-ending debate. Okay. All right. So we have risk likelihood versus risk impact. These are things you need to we also need to figure out. Like, man, Godzilla would really destroy our network, but should we really plan for a Godzilla attack, right? You've heard me rant on about that, so I won't spend too much. I think that goes for itself. Likelihood is measured in time, right? How if our network runs with this current security level for the next 10 years, how many times can we expect the web server to get defaced? How many times can we expect our customer information to get publicly released, right? We're measuring that in time. Once every 5 years, once every 10 years. Well, that's what we're talking about likelihood. Okay. Impact is measured in dollars. Well, okay, if our customers, the data is put out on the website or out on the dark web or whatever, how much is that going to cost our company, right? And again, that's debatable because some companies have actually turned around and made money off of it. So I'm looking at you, Equifax. Anyway, there we go. So risk likelihood. All right, let's talk about risk likelihood. These are the calculations. These are things we got to memorize. These are things we're going to calculate, figure out. How likely will a threat occur, right? And we're going to talk about the different types of threats, okay? We have mean time, that's before to failure, mean time to failure, MTTF. How long before something needs to be replaced? Okay, replaced, okay? In other words, it can't be fixed, all right? We're going to just replace it. We're going to throw it out or send it back to the manufacturer for a refund or whatever, but we're not going to keep it, okay? MTBF, mean time before failure, is how long before something needs to be fixed, okay? So, like, case in point, a web server, bad memory. If the memory, well, that's a little, let's just say there's a memory fault and a website goes down. The JavaScript isn't executing correctly because variables not being stored in memory correctly, and we're gonna need to reboot the web server, right? In that case, it's a fix. We're fixing it. We're going to reboot it and we're going to clear the memory, and then things should be backing up, right? That's MTBF, right? How long before we need to fix it? Okay, MTTF would be something like a hard drive, right? How long until that hard drive, the head just crashes into the platter, comes to a screeching halt, and damages that hard drive beyond repair? Okay, that's an MTTF, right? And then we have to replace that hard drive. Okay. As a matter of fact, MTTF, meantime to failure, is going to be hotly debated. As a matter of fact, if you want to have fun, go to a hard drive website. I'm sure you guys have seen these before. Websites where they're very focused on just hard drive performance. There's a hot debate about MTTF measurement techniques and are they accurate, or should we use more of a fit rating? There's another rating that's now making its way around, a more qualitative rating that's being used by hard drive manufacturers. There's an active debate as to how to best measure these things. Again, there's no perfect way. This is not an exact science. We're not measuring tree width, right? What we're doing is we're projecting the future. And whenever you're projecting something in the future, there's always going to be gray area debate and wiggle room, right? Especially when you have the manufacturer rating their own stuff, right? All right, mean time before failure is how long something needs to be fixed. Mean time to recovery is how long will it take us to fix it, right? The website's down, or the server's down, the database server's down. How long, assuming a certain failure, how long before we can get it back up? That's mean time to recovery, okay? Does that mean we have to recover a backup, all that kind of a thing? Fit, how many failures can we give in a specific length of time? So fit doesn't specify a time length. So you like a fit 1 year, a fit 5 year, fit 10 year, fit 100 year, whatever you have. Usually with IT equipment, we only really care about the next 10 years anyway. We don't really expect IT equipment to last more than 10 years. At least as it stands right now. So you'll see fit ratings for 1 year where it'd be like 0.01. What's that mean? Well, every 1,000 years I expect it to fail, because that's the 1,000th place, right? Or 0.1, that means every 10 years I would expect it to fail, right? For a fit in 1 year, right? Or if I have a fit in 5 years of 1, that means I expect it to fail once a year or once every 5 years, okay? And then we have ARO, which we're going to actually use in calculations, which is how many times in a year will we get a failure, right? We can then project costs if we know how to recover from said failure, okay? So annual, what's the ARO stand for? My brain just gave up on me there. I have it here. So it's ARO, annualized rate of occurrence. That's it. So the likelihood of a risk recurring in 1 year's time. All right, sorry about that. My brain just gave out on me. So again, what's the difference between fit and ARO is they're in a way they're kind of related, but it's ARO that you're actually going to use in your calculations. Okay. And these are the calculations, all right? So putting dollar amounts to those failures. We have what's called a SLE, which is single loss expectancy. We have asset value, which is going to be the actual dollar amounts. Exposure factor is the percentage of loss of the value of the asset, right? This is going to be completely subjective, right? And again, this is hopefully you get an expert to come in to set that. But what you're saying, hey, is if your website goes down and you make, this is what we're going to do for the practice, and you make, $300,000 a year from that website, from the sales of that website, right? So we have $300,000 is what you make from that website, and it goes down. Well, how long does it go down for? All this stuff. It's not like you're going to go out of business and no one's ever going to hit your website. You're not going to lose all $300,000, right? But you'll lose some part of that $300,000, right? Some people go, this company doesn't know what the hell they're doing. I'm going to go buy from a different company. So it depends on your competitors, depends on your product, depends on your customers. It depends on lots of different variables. And this is where you come down. You're going to say, well, if your website goes down, it will affect, you're going to lose, maybe 5% of your business, right? There's that time it's actually down, right? And then you're going to lose maybe future businesses. Someone else looks to bring their business somewhere else, right? That's what exposure factor is. So the percentage of loss of that asset. How much value are you going to lose on that asset, right? So quite simple, SLE, is going to be your asset value times your exposure factor, right? Whatever that is. So you're going to lose 5%. So it'd be $300,000, like I said, times your exposure factor. And I said you lose 5%. So that'd be 0.05. That's why I put a point there just to let you know. It'd be 0.05. That's 5%. So $300,000 times 0.05, 5% loss. My math is 60,000. Yeah. So 5 times 6 is 30. So it'd be 60,000. You lose $60,000. So that your SLE would be 60,000 off the top of my head. Then you can sit there and say, well, how often does that happen, right? How often does my website go down? And let's just say the ARO in that is like 0.1, right? So there's a 0.1, there's a 10% chance it goes down every year, or we expect it to have to go down once every 10 years. Different ways you can say that, right? And that becomes the ARO. So then I could take that loss, which I said was $60,000, I believe, off the top of my head. $60,000, I can multiply it times 0.1, and that's going to just bring it down to $6,000, right? So then we're sitting there saying the annual loss expectancy is $6,000. So yeah, you're not going to lose that out of your bank account every year, but what we can do is project this out with simple math, and we're going to put math in a way we're just kind of using math to make this more solid than a solid argument than it really is, but. We can assume it's as if we're losing $6,000 a year the way our current website runs because we're afraid of it. So should we buy a redundant website? Does that does the cost justify it? Well, to have a redundant website and a load balancer on there would cost us $30,000. And then a CFO would sit there and say, well, I'm expecting to lose $6,000 a year, right? and you want $30,000, I'll make my money back in 5 years' time. That's the way CFOs think, right? They're justifying the costs at all times in their head, bean counters, right? So by using these tools and this math, what we're doing is we're justifying costs, and we're justifying ways we can make the network more solid, more secure. Okay, because you remember we have a three-facet mission, right? In data security, accessibility, right? Integrity and confidentiality, right? And to improve any of those, by buying a load balancer and having two websites running side by side, we're ensuring integrity, because if one web server gets completely blown up, we now have a backup one, and we're improving accessibility. So remember, we have a three-phase plan too, as well. It's a three-facet plan objective. Again, that's what a CFO is going to do, is going to try to justify the cost of that. Again, like I said, whatever it was, $30,000 or whatever for the load balancer and the extra web server, and sit there saying, well, we're you know, our AL, our annual loss expectancy is $6,000 a year, so it makes sense. If 5 years, we're paying off that future debt by incurring debt now. Okay. Any questions about that? This is what we're going to be doing in the practice. I'm just going to give you a scenario. I'll walk you through. I'll walk you through the way to calculate it, and then you're going to calculate and justify the cost of future upgrades. So, all right, let's talk about one more thing, which is representing risk itself. We can have what's called a risk register. A risk register is just a big list of risks. So here's my example of one. Again, this is kind of fun for a risk register for barbecue party. Okay, again, we're using Wikipedia here. We have category. We have different categories. So we have guests, right? What could go wrong with the guests? Well, the guests can find the party boring, right? Probability low. I throw a good party, right? Impact medium. How can we mitigate this, right? Well, we can invite crazy friends. Well, all right. Provide sufficient liquor. Contingency, bring out the karaoke, right? So, and then here's a qualitative, risk score after mitigation, right? So what this is saying is, what we're going to do, right? So again, it's just a big list of different risks we can have, right? Again, we can have a fire, right? Not enough food is spoiled. These are all possible risks. And again, this isn't a full list of everything that can go wrong. And that's kind of one of the problems we're going to have with risk register, is risk registers can get very silly, very quick, right? Again, Godzilla attack, zombie apocalypse. What should we put on here? What shouldn't we put on there, right? And then there'd be, anyway. So the point is, it can get kind of crazy really quickly, but it can also be very incomplete as well. We might be missing something. So, but that's what we're doing with a risk register. It's just we're putting to cite a list of possible risks that we need to keep in mind and possibilities we can do to fix it. There's no set way. There's no perfect way to make a risk register. It can be less detailed than this. It can be, there are some, Prince2 is a very popular one. There are different standards for risk registers. But again, there's no perfect way to do one, right? And we also have the risk matrix, which is having a chart go to it, where essentially, in this case, this chart's going to get the extent of damages, how damaging the risk is, and the likelihood of occurrence. Again, a Godzilla attack is highly unlikely, but it would be very damaging, right? Not to pick on, or I'm just, anyway. So that's what the score is right here, right? And what this allows us to do is sit there and say, okay, risk number 2 it's highly likely and it'd be highly damaging. That's what we need to focus on, right? Is risk number 2. So by putting it to a chart, it's helping us do is visualizing and figuring out what is more important. I got a couple of chats here. It sounds like an attack tree, the risk register. It is in a way. So someone just mentioned that the risk register looks like an attack tree. It depends on how detailed it is, especially with the mitigation and the contingency. but the threat tree is more about setting up. And where's the good threat tree? Let me. I'm going to minimize this a little bit so I can. No, that's the crappy threat tree. There's a good threat tree. A threat tree is more kind of figuring out the process, right? We're worried about people reading users' email, and that's where you can sit there with the risk registers, sit there and say, what would show up on the risk register is this right here, right? So the risk register would say, hey, the risk is we could bribe a network engineer. That's a risk, right? Threaten a network engineer would be a risk. Exploit OS vulnerability would be a risk on the email server. Acquire valid user. These are all possible risks right here, right? The attack tree helps us get to the specific risk. So that's where they're different, but I agree there's a similarity, right? They're both getting to the same point, okay? But yes, I agree. And again, it's all about kind of that threat, and a threat is related to a risk, right? Without a threat, we don't have a risk. Without an asset, we don't have a risk. So they are all married together in a way. Any other questions or points before I move on to the summary? Right. All right, so let me move on to the summary, and I'll open up the floor for questions, and then we'll call it a virtual lecture. Assets plus threat equals risks. If threats are greater than one, therefore risk is greater than one, right? Again, using math to kind of make it seem like this is more scientific than it is. Threat evaluation and asset evaluation are tied to risk evaluation, right? If you don't evaluate your risk properly, you don't evaluate your assets properly, your risk elevation is going to be evaluation is going to be crap, right? You need to be able to evaluate all the threat and the asset in order for risk to be evaluation. Threat assessment may use a threat list or a threat matrix. Calculations, we either have quantitative or qualitative. We're going to use both actually. But we have quantitative. Remember, quantitative is going to be more dollar amount. We're talking about quantities. We're talking about impact. How much will this cost us if we get attacked? Qualitative is more like risk factor, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. It's a rating through 1 through 10. I like it, right? It's very subjective and very susceptible to biases as well. So we have failures and time. We have mean time to failure. Mean time before failure, mean time to recovery, failures in time, annualized, ARO just will not work for my brain. Rate of, my brain just will not take it for some reason, of occurrence, analyzed rate of occurrence. All right. My brain won't remember that. And we got ARO, right? Again, all we're doing is measuring fail times and recovery times. In the case of MTTR, meter, as it's often called in the industry, mean time till recovery. But what we're doing is we're looking at failures, and we're looking how often they occur in time, or how long it will take us to recover from something. Then we have our dollar evaluations, a single loss evaluation, and then an annual loss, right? Those are going to tell us how much we lose in a single event, and how much we, based off the ARO, how much does that mean we're losing every year, right? If we want to spread it out through every year. We need to try to stay as objective as possible. Again, this is very difficult because the human brain is so full of biases, and we need full access, right? That's one thing that does concern someone, is they say, oh, we've had a risk assessment, but we didn't let them go anywhere near our numbers, our dollar amounts, or how much money we actually make. Well, then one has to wonder about, especially their quantitative calculations. If they don't truly know how much money you made, and how do they know what the SLE or the ALE is going to be, right? Because that's based a lot off the asset value. And if they can't get to the actual dollar amounts, then they would have a hard time assessing the assets, the values of the asset. All right, I'll open it up for questions. Let me stop the share and bring up the view. Any questions?
To go back to the matrices and all of the threats and everything, just to make sure I'm on the right path. So when we have everything like lined up in whatever chart that you have set up, and like the highest and like I'm trying to find the word for it, the highest threat, would that be like the most prioritized, like the company has to look forward to?
Yeah. So with this chart here, this is the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so with this chart right here, again, it's a two vector chart. So you're going to have the extent of damages, right? So case in point, for example, this is a pretty clear cut that risk number 2 is really nasty. But let's just say risk number 1, for example, was in this same area but much higher, and risk number 2 was in this area but much lower, like down here, right? We might sit there and say, well, listen, it's less likely, but man, it's going to cause a lot more damage. Risk number 1 is going to cause a lot more damage. Let's say it's up here instead. I don't know if you can see my, can you see my mouse pointer when I do this?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say risk number 1 is up here and risk number 2 is down here, but they're the same column position. They're in the same position as far as along this chart, along the likelihood of occurrence. So if risk 1 was up here, though, it's very high damages, but it's only possible. Well, risk 2 is very low damages, and but it's still very likely. We might want to consider risk 1 instead because of the amount of damage it can cause, right?
Okay, that makes sense.
That's what we're trying to accomplish by the risk matrix. Again, though, you might have a serious disagreement. You could be an expert sitting right next to another expert, and this other expert produces their risk matrix, and you're just like, I disagree with this. I think you are underselling risk 2. Like I think risk 2 can cause a lot more damage than you're representing there, right? So again, there's going to be a lot of subjectivity, but hopefully people can kind of agree both the likelihood and the damage caused. And if there's agreement on that, then we can start agreeing on what risk to start addressing first. Does that make sense, Boozley?
Yeah, and then from that, you then do the whole math sort of deal right after, right?
Well, again, I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? I just want to make sure I picked up.
If you look at the threat, like let's say everyone's on the same page, we prioritize, let's say, risk 2, and then we start looking more in depth. It's like, okay, how do we fix this? Like we pull up the numbers and everything.
Right.
Would that be like a logical assumption to do afterwards?
Yeah. So the next step would probably be like looking at risks, like going back here and looking at risk number 2 and saying, okay, or risk 1. Let's look at risk 1. Okay, how do we mitigate risk 1, right? And that might come back to a risk list, or that might come down to a brainstorming session or a threat tree. And we say, okay, these are the possible vulnerabilities we perceive that would cause risk 1, if that's the one we're attacking, that's going to cause all this damage. So let's look at risk 1, how it's possible, and now how are we going to mitigate those threats? Now it comes down to mitigate, or again, like all risk, right? Because threat is risk. We can mitigate the risk, right? We can do things about it and try to prevent it from happening. We can avoid the risk and just say we'll wash our hands with it, and we'll pay someone else to host that website or do something else, right? Or maybe we'll pay someone else to come in and give us suggestions on how to mitigate this. That's not really avoidance or transference. That'd be transference. Or we can avoid it by just shutting down the website and say we don't need to have that website. It's not worth the money, right? I don't know, right? So we can avoid the risk too. So then we have to have a discussion about that. We have to, and then we said, no, we're going to mitigate it. Okay, how do we mitigate it? And then one part of this might be, okay, how much does risk number 1 actually make the company? What asset is this? What is exposing this asset? How much is this asset worth? Well, if we want to keep this going, if the asset's worth that much, how much should we spend to protect it, right? That would be also part of like, what's going to be the budget for this, or if we want to protect it, right? So this all comes into your cybersecurity security. It's funny, someone just put out a book that got really well reviewed for cybersecurity. So I was thumbing through it. It was on Packet, so I was thumbing through it, and this particular author went out of their way to poo-poo cybersecurity strategies. Like, don't have a strategy, just worry about tactics, right? And I was a little, and I tend to like that kind of talk. I agree. I mean, it depends on where you're at. If you sit there and you're like, oh, well, we need to figure out our strategy for like a year before we even do anything, that's ridiculous, right? But this is where strategy comes in. Looking at your threat matrix and sitting there saying, we need to tackle risk number 1 because this one is going to cause us a lot of damage, even though it's less likely than risk number 2, which will cause us less damage. that's part of your strategy, is figuring out the strategy. And plus, how many things are tied together, right? Maybe if I have an intrusion detection system, maybe risk number 2 and risk number 1 are two different on 2 different servers, but they're on the same network. And if I put intrusion and prevention on that network, it would lower both risks, right? Then that's part of a strategy that's less tactical. Okay, so that's where strategy would come in, I think, too. That's why there's so much discussion. Like I said, figuring out the dollar amounts and figuring out how much we can spend, that's going to be part of your strategy, right? And how to smartly spend that money in an intelligent way, that's part of strategy. But tactics would then come down and look at the threats and say, okay, the threat here is this server can be exposed by exploits for the OS vulnerability. Well, should we have a different operating system? Should we, make sure we patch it more effectively? Should we hire someone to do a pen test, which will bring us to next week when we talk about pen testing? So, again, that would all be part of the strategy and all be part of the tactics. Those are tactics to address each particular threat. How does that fit with the company's overall strategy? Well, that's up to the CIO and the CISO, right? Or it may be the same person. A lot of times it is the same person. So does that answer your question, Leslie?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Anyone that wants to stick around can stick around.